Hello, this is Pastor Brian Oliver from Wesley United Methodist Church in Muscatine, Iowa, and I am recording a version of a presentation that I made on Sunday, January 12th at our church on Sunday afternoon to discuss the protocol of grace and reconciliation through separation that's recently been released by a group of United Methodist leaders to come to a resolution on our debate over human sexuality within the United Methodist Church. It's my intention in this video to have this as a resource available to other people in our church, but also to share it with other folks. So you may share it. If you find this, you may share it however you think is helpful. This is not everything that I said at that town hall meeting, but it is the core of that content. And so thank you for watching this, and I hope this is helpful. So I set some ground rules for the purpose of our discussion that we had this past Sunday. It's my intention to provide information. It wasn't my intention to, either then or now, to enter into any kind of debate. I don't really want to change anyone's mind. At the outset, I would say that I identify as a traditionalist. You'll come to know what that means in a moment if you don't. But it is not my intention to change anyone's mind. It's not my intention to argue or debate. It's simply my intention to provide what I think is a brief overview of the information that we will need to know now and would need to know as we move forward. Well, so first we need to understand what is the current position of the United Methodist Church in regards to homosexuality. And so the Book of Discipline says that all persons, including LGBTQ plus persons, all persons are of sacred worth, but the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And so, at least from the discipline's perspective, there is that distinction between how we regard persons. Persons are loved, and persons are accepted, and persons are valued, versus practices which we can exercise discretion and discernment on the validity of practices and their sinfulness and their regard for Christian teaching. And so because of that position, currently self-avowed practicing homosexuals may not serve as clergy in the United Methodist Church, nor can ceremonies celebrating same-sex unions be performed in our churches or by our clergy. And so that's the current position. That is, those, in one form or another, those have been in the Book of Discipline since 1972. And of course, the United Methodist Church has only existed since 1968. So the next thing we need to deal with, I think, is discussing who's who. What are the various sides and what do they want? First, we talk about progressives. We avoid language of like tradition or liberal or conservative. I have tried to, although sometimes I often slip up. I have tried to use language like liberal or conservative just because of the political baggage that has in our own political context in the United States, and that may not translate well to other cultures. And so we use the terms progressives, traditionalists, and centrists. Progressives are those who seek to change the current position of the church. They seek to allow for the ordination of LGBTQ plus persons, and they seek to allow for same-sex marriages to be performed in our churches. And so they really want to eliminate the language that was on the previous slide from our Book of Discipline. And their primary value is inclusion. The traditionalists, which I've said already that I am, seek to maintain the current position of the church. They think that the current position of the church is fair, is balanced, is aligned with Scripture and historic Christian teaching. And so their primary value is faithfulness to Scripture. Now let me back up here and say that in saying that, It's not that I don't believe that progressives value Scripture. I think they very much do. I think that what motivates them is their own reading of Scripture that they would say is different from traditionalists. So just to say the primary value doesn't mean that's their only value or that they don't value other things. There's a group of folks that are known as centrists, and they seek some sort of compromise or middle way to keep the church together. Mostly what I hear from centrists is that they would like to see the position of the discipline changed with regard to ordination and marriage, but they want to avoid the division of the church over those issues. And so their primary value is institutional unity. And at least for progressives and traditionalists, I want to be completely fair in saying that I believe that my progressive brothers and sisters come at their position with a pure heart. I believe that they believe that they are seeking the right thing, that they are seeking justice, that they are seeking inclusion, that they honestly don't see the practice of homosexuality as sinful, therefore they don't see any reason to continue the discrimination, in their view, with regards to ordination and marriage. And I want to say I very strongly respect that position. I very strongly respect the love from which that position comes. And that is to say that their position is motivated by a pure faith, I believe. And so they would say that indeed what the church is currently doing now is sinful. The fact that the church is discriminating against these persons in these ways is actually sinful, and the church right now as it stands is participating in grievous sins against these folks. The traditionalists, on the other hand, would say, from an equally strong position of faith, would say that the way they read the Bible tells them that the homosexual behavior is sinful, and that the current position of the church is right and fair, and that where the progressives would lead the church into would be grievous sin. And I say that not to heighten the debate, but just to show that these are important, heartfelt issues on both sides, and both sides want to have a church that is faithful and that is fair and that is obedient to Scripture and is not in sin as they would see it. So real quickly, for those of you who may not know, I want to give a real quick, hopefully quick, refresher course on United Methodist polity. For those of you who don't know, because otherwise the news media, when the secular media received the protocol that we're going to talk about in a moment, it made it seem to some that these changes had already happened and that this was the way the church was going to go, and that was it. But I want to remind everyone that General Conference is the only body that speaks for the whole church. General Conference is made up of 800 some odd delegates from all the annual conferences from all over the world. A reminder that we are a global church. And about 40% of the United Methodist Church currently doesn't live in the United States, and most of them are from Africa. And so people come from all over the world to participate in General Conference, which is typically once every 4 years. Our last regular General Conference was in 2016 in Portland, Oregon. Our next regular General Conference will be in 2020 in May in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then we had recently a special General Conference in February of 2019 in St. Louis, which I'll talk about in a minute. The General Church is also made up of the Council of Bishops. That's an important body for you to be aware of, which includes all the bishops from all over the world. Also, the Judicial Council, which acts as the Church's Supreme Court, which is a big player in these kinds of decisions, and can rule based on our church's constitution whether the actions of any part of the church, General Conference, annual conferences, so forth, is constitutional under church law. And then we have our general boards and agencies, things you may have heard like UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, or the Publishing House, or the Board of Pensions, or the general boards and agencies. The church is divided then into jurisdictional conferences in the United States and central conferences outside of the United States. And primarily these bodies are about the business of electing bishops for their geographical areas, but also serve in providing some other regional functions. Particularly the central conferences are able to make some accommodations to their context at the central conference level. There are 5 jurisdictional conferences within the United States, and we are in Iowa. We are in the North Central jurisdiction. I know some of you may end up getting this outside of Iowa, but Iowa, anyway, is in the North Central jurisdiction, which includes the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and North and South Dakota. Each jurisdictional or central conference has a college of bishops, not to be confused with the council of bishops, which is all the bishops. The college of bishops includes all the bishops from that geographical area. Annual conferences are referred to as the basic bodies of the church. Annual conferences are those conferences to which local churches and clergy members are attached. Annual conferences examine and ordain and appoint members of the clergy to their charges. And we, of course, are in the Iowa Conference, which is contiguous with the state of Iowa in our case, but that is not the case for every annual conference. For instance, in our own jurisdiction, you have, for instance, the state of Illinois includes 2 annual conferences, the Northern Illinois Conference and the Illinois Great Rivers Conference. And then if you go to Minnesota and the Dakotas, they are 3 states, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, within one annual conference, the Minnesota Dakotas Conference. Annual conferences are further divided into districts for administrative purposes. In our case, Iowa is divided into 8 districts, and Muscatine finds itself in the Southeast District. Local churches, which you're probably more familiar with, are governed by a charge conference. So you see this language of conference. Charge conferences, annual conferences, jurisdictional conferences, general conferences, up the chain. Local churches are governed by a charge conference. A charge is a group of churches, one or more churches to which a pastor may be appointed. And they meet usually once a year, and then during the year they work through their church council or their various committees. Before we leave the discussion of polity, the trust clause is something that you should be familiar with for the purpose of this discussion. The trust clause states that all property, local church property and beyond, is held in trust for the denomination. That is, the Board of Trustees of the local church holds that property in trust for the United Methodist Church as a whole, such that churches can't simply depart from the denomination with their property. And when the local church does close, if they haven't otherwise made arrangements for the disposition of their property, then the annual conference has to step in and do that. So how did we get here? That's a very good question, and the history is long and hard. And I do want to say that, in fairness, that especially for many traditionalists, this issue is much larger than human sexuality. There has been a deepening and broadening theological divide within the United Methodist Church for a few decades now or more. It is the human sexuality issue is maybe perhaps stated as a symptom, however, a rather important symptom of an ongoing divide that's been going on in the United Methodist Church between folks that are more traditional theologically and folks that are more progressive theologically for a long time. And so that's all I'm going to say about the way back history of that. But instead, I'm going to kind of start this story really at General Conference in 2016. Again, the progressive group has been trying to change the church's stand since it was adopted. There was a group even back in 1972 that was trying to keep that language from entering the discipline in the first place. And they have tried, progressives had tried in every annual conference or every general conference to remove that language in one way or another, and have not been successful in doing so. At General Conference of 2016, it was becoming apparent that yet again those attempts would not succeed legislatively, and so this is the product of a lot of discussions and debates both on and off the floor of General Conference that have been pointed out to me. But I'm just going to choose not to enter into those. If you know those or want to research those on your own, that's fine. But at General Conference 2016, the Council of Bishops was asked to develop a plan to resolve this debate over human sexuality. And the plan that the Council of Bishops put forward was the creation of a commission on the way forward. A 32-member commission of folks from all over the church and from all theological perspectives to develop a plan that we could move forward. And some people were talking about separation being on the table then, and I think it was considered, but it wasn't what came out of that Commission on the Way Forward process. Instead, what came out of the Commission on the Way Forward process was a few different plans, and other plans were submitted as well. And a special general conference was called for February of 2019 in St. Louis. And although there were several plans available to the delegates then, the story really became the story of the one church plan versus what was known as the traditional or traditionalist plan. The one church plan would have called for the discipline to be changed, the book of discipline to be changed, in other words, the language about homosexuality to be removed, and that churches could allow same-sex marriages on their property or not, that pastors could perform same-sex marriages or not, as their conscience would lead them to do so, and then that annual conferences would be able to choose or not to ordain LGBTQ plus persons. The traditional plan did not pass. Rather, what did pass that general conference was the traditional plan, which retained the current language and restrictions of the Book of Discipline, increased penalties for clergy that would violate that, and also, close some loopholes. I don't like using necessarily that language. It makes me sound biased, but close some loopholes in the process of holding clergy accountable who, for instance, perform same-sex weddings, or for whom are LGBTQ plus persons who are active in that. Of course, there was a great aftermath after the passage of the traditionalist plan. People were very upset. And again, it passed by a 54% majority. 54% was the passage of the traditional plan, and so a lot of people became very angry. There were many kinds of demonstrations and other groups that gathered both for and against, and really it heightened, if anything, the level of debate, the level of rancor within the United Methodist Church around these things, rather than solving any problems. Which brings us to the discussion of the protocol, which is what you've all been waiting for. The rest of this has been background. The protocol, which I've been calling the protocol, and I think other people have been calling it that for short, officially is the protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation, that's been developed by a group of leaders, 16 leaders, representing all these perspectives and representing also Central Conference leaders, came together with the help of a professional mediator and came to a compromised plan for the separation of the United Methodist Church, or at least the separation of a church out of the United Methodist Church. And so the protocol calls for the creation of at least one other Methodist denomination, which would be traditionalist. The assumption going around, although it's not 100% for certain, but the assumption going around is that the Wesleyan Covenant Association, the WCA, would serve as the vanguard of that new traditionalist denomination, with the outline that they've already released as a draft book of doctrines and disciplines for that new denomination. So at least one other Methodist denomination will be created, perhaps more. The United Methodist Church, as it is, would remain legally intact, albeit people would leave, and it would remain progressive and centrist. That is, that they would allow for ordination of LGBTQ plus persons and allow for same-sex marriage. So then, I need to say, central conferences would have an opportunity to choose to align with the new denomination if they voted to do so by a 2/3 majority. Annual conferences may vote by a 57% majority to align with another denomination. And if they don't vote, or if they fail to achieve that 57% majority, they would remain aligned officially with the what's called the post-separation United Methodist Church, which again would be progressive or centrist. And if they did achieve that 57% majority, then they would align with one of those other denominations that were created, the traditionalist denomination, for example. Then local churches, and I need to say how they arrived at that 57%. That was actually a compromise. Traditionalists who are part of the conversation really thought that it should be a majority vote, a simple majority, 50% plus one, while progressives really insisted that it be a 2/3 majority vote of the annual conference. And as I listened to folks talk about, and I also listened to a recent panel discussion with those who are members of that mediation team, said that this was a real sticking point for them, and eventually they compromised on that 57% majority. Once annual conferences have made their decision, then the local churches would choose to follow the local churches would follow their annual conference. So if their annual conference were to remain United Methodist, Progressive Centrist, post-separation United Methodist, that the local churches would follow them unless they vote to do so. Unless they vote not to do so, I'm sorry. And but if an annual conference were to vote to join another denomination, then their local churches would automatically follow them unless they voted not to do so. So the local church vote is dependent upon the annual conference vote. And so church council will decide whether or not a vote would be taken, and then by what majority that vote would be required to carry, whether it be a simple majority or a 2/3 majority. And then the vote would be taken at a charge conference of that local church. And then the trust clause would not be enforced on those local churches who choose to separate from the United Methodist Church. They would be able to do that with all of their buildings, all of their assets, and indeed all of their liabilities, and take all that with them, with the caveat that they must join one of the post-separation Methodist denominations, and they must continue to participate in Westpath, the clergy pension system. So they're still obligated to participate in those pension liabilities. In the meantime, there will be a moratorium on all disciplinary procedures regarding LGBTQ plus clergy and same-sex weddings. We would just stop all of those charges and trials and processes that are currently ongoing until this situation is resolved. There's going to be some money changing hands. $25 million over the next 4 years would be paid by the UMC to the new denomination. Now, I want to say that also there is $2 million set aside for any other denominations that want to form. They would have to split that up. But $25 million would be paid to the new traditionalist denomination. And my understanding is they arrived at that number by simply looking at the assets of the church and looking at the projected math of the separation and deciding what's fair. Again, a negotiated compromise settlement. The Traditionalist United Methodist, or the Traditionalist denomination, would, in addition to the $25 million they would receive, they would also forego an additional $13 million that would become part of a larger $39 million fund. So the Traditionalists are setting aside $13 million. The United Methodist Church, Progressive Centrist, remaining United Methodist Church would set aside $26 million to continue to fund ministries to racially marginalized communities, things like Africa University and so forth, to continue on our denominational commitment that we've made to those folks as we seek what's fair in terms of assets that have been paid in and how they're used. As I said before, all churches will continue to participate in the pension plan, and in fact, that Westpath would be able to take that they would have to continue to participate in the pension plan, and that if churches really wanted to not be a part of any of these denominations, then they would be assessed their share of ongoing pension liabilities before they could depart. And then other shared ministries may continue, and both churches will continue to be in an ecumenical relationship. And I would even dare say that in certain very, very open circumstances, churches and pastors and bishops that were open to this, I could even see cross-denominational appointments taking place to see that churches are served. But I can't say that with any kind of authority. But I do know that these churches will continue to be in ministry relationship with one another into the foreseeable future. So when's all this going to shake down? Well, the protocol itself will be voted on at General Conference in 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and that will take place May 5th through the 15th. And so nothing happens until General Conference gets a chance to vote on it, and they may reject it outright, they may accept it, they may change it, amend it, although from what I've heard from some folks, this is such a carefully negotiated and compromised and mediated settlement that I think if anybody really tried to amend it or monkey with it at General Conference, I think, based on what I've heard other people say, that the whole thing would really fall apart. So then annual conferences will have until July 1st of 2021 to make their decisions. And so so General Conference votes, the new denomination, at least one, is formed. Annual conferences then make a decision whether to remain, or I guess the decision would be to depart. They make a decision whether or not they are going to depart the United Methodist Church for the new Traditionalist denomination. And then after annual conferences make their decision, local churches will have until December 31st of 2024 to make their decisions whether they're going to follow their annual conferences or whether they're going to go a different direction than their annual conference decided to go. So I want to say here, and maybe this reveals my bias, and I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but maybe it's not the end of the world. And what do I mean by maybe it's not the end of the world? Well, I would say that the church is often multiplied by dividing, if that makes any sense. And so we look back at Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 15. Paul and Barnabas had already been out on a missionary journey together. They had already had great success together, but they were getting ready to go out again. And Barnabas wanted to take Mark of the Gospel of Mark fame with them on their journey, and he was a young man, probably a teenager at the time, maybe, and Paul did not want to take him because the last time they took him, he left them halfway through and got homesick and went back home, and so Paul didn't want to take him again. And the scripture tells us that there was sharp contention. There was a sharp division between Paul and Barnabas, so sharp, in fact, that they parted company. Paul took Silas and went one way, and Barnabas took Mark and went another. And the great thing about that is that they had twice the evangelistic impact. They had twice the missional impact that they would have had if they stayed together. And you can also think about the story of Abraham and Lot, for that matter, of dividing. Is let's stop fighting, let you go your way, I'll go my way, and maybe the kingdom will be built like that. And so you also think of the Reformation, right? If people were never willing to say, hey, we differ enough on this that while we can love each other and while maybe we can do some other things together, we really can't worship together anymore. That's how deep our division is. And so rather than continue to fight, let's separate. And you see that with Martin Luther, although maybe not as kind. Maybe Martin Luther wasn't as kind as that. But so you see the Reformation. And so if there wouldn't have been a Reformation if everybody just said, let's go along with whatever the church says in whichever direction the church goes. Rather, people stand up and say, no, sometimes the church can be wrong, one way or the other. And the same thing's true of the Methodist revival. If there wasn't a problem in the Church of England, then there never would have been a Methodist movement, and we wouldn't have even been here. We'd all still been Anglicans or Catholics if there wasn't a Reformation. So division is not always a bad thing. Sometimes division is the way God gets his people spread out to do his mission in the world. I think it's a way for each group to continue in ministry according to their own conscience. I think that traditionalists and progressives have very different consciences, and their consciences come from a pure heart, as I've said before, and they have very different visions of how they want to do ministry, and those are in irreconcilable conflict right now. And right now we're harming each other's ministry. We're harming our own ministries by continuing to be in this debate, and we can set each other free and maybe do better things. Now, here's where my bias comes out, is because we know what the WCA has in mind for a new denomination because they've issued some documents. Assuming the WCA becomes the vanguard of that new traditional denomination, it at least will have drastically lower apportionments, probably a half to a third of current apportionments for many churches, because they're going to have less bureaucracy. They're going to be a much flatter structure, and they're going to leave more resources in the hands of the local church to determine how they're going to do ministry. Less bureaucracy. Bishops are going to be term limited. District superintendents are going to serve in their roles probably as a part-time role in addition to pastoring a church. And then local churches are going to have more input on who is appointed as their pastor. They're going to have much more say of looking at pastors available. From what I can tell, they'll be able to look at pastors available and maybe select some that they're interested in. But that's all in work. But anyway, there'll be much more local control, much more local input over who is appointed as a pastor. And I want to leave this because I think many churches are very, very concerned about their buildings, and many churches are very concerned about the institutional future. And I read something in the last couple of weeks that really stuck with me, and had nothing to do with any of this, but it said we're called to build God's kingdom, not our own castles. And I would just leave you with that. And feel free, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me. I'm going to, both when this shows up on YouTube and when it shows up on Facebook, I'm going to tag some documents, some links to some further information for you, where you can find more information. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I ask you to join me in praying for the United Methodist Church in the days and months and years ahead.